to make sure that our universities co-evolve as the African reality changes. We cannot afford to have African universities remaining static. Universities have the largest concentration of the nation's brightest. That's an institution that needs to be nurtured. Okay. Anywhere in the world, you will not find a concentration of society's brightest, a higher concentration of society's brightest outside of your institutions of higher learning. Now, if one were to look at the question of intellectual languages through the lens of shared thematic concerns, then one could say that we're seeing a number of these becoming cross-cutting.
Good morning and welcome to the Solomon Atah Podcast, a podcast that we speak to researchers and academics and policymakers on the continent and across the world. And today we are very delighted that we are joined by Professor Gerald Ouma, who is a professor of higher education and Senior Director of Institutional Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Prof, welcome and good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having me, Solomon.
How are you today? How is UP, very important institution of learning on the continent?
Indeed, it's a bit cold here. It's been raining the whole night, which is also indicative of, what happens during this time of the year. The university, the students are busy with exams, so the campus is a bit quiet. The students are busy. We've had a very productive year. We hope to end on a high note. So far, so good.
Okay, so you're going to increase the rankings because I understand that universities always want to, and UP is in a good place. I mean, UP is always, their rankings are always up there with the rest of the world.
No, yes, UP performs well in the rankings, but I think I should clarify that it's not something that we are quite obsessed about. We just want to do our things. We want to impact society. We want to produce knowledge that matters. We want to produce graduates who make a difference in society. And we want to be in society for society. If the rankings recognize that and rank us highly, that's a bonus.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes.
No, I know you are being modest about it, and that's actually wonderful. But I do know that universities like soccer teams, they are always wanting to be better, which is a wonderful thing. They want to challenge themselves and always continuously do better than their peers, which is the whole point.
Which is actually, one might say, a good thing, but also potentially problematic.
How so, Prof?
Yes. So it's part of the evolving context in which we operate. And so universities like soccer teams are inherently competitive.
Okay.
They want to be on top of the league table, Universities are set up to do something else.
Okay.
And I would emphasize more collaboration, more partnerships, all right, as opposed to more competition.
I see.
So competition is an inherent aspect of the fields of higher education, just like soccer teams. Once you're in the same broader field, there's always that temptation to want to compete. But I would go for universities, in fact, emphasizing a lot more collaboration and partnership.
Absolutely. And we will get into that, Prof. So let me start by saying you have worked across research, administration, Pan-African policy spaces. Can you share a defining moment in your career, perhaps even right now at the University of Pretoria, or the Partnership for Africa Social and Governance Research, or the Dakar Summit that have really shaped the role of universities in the future? Or that will continuously shape the role of Africa's future from the university?
Yes. So, Solomon, it's difficult to talk about one moment. If you permit me, let me talk about a couple of moments. One of a personal nature and then professional Yeah. So I was born in Nairobi. I grew up in the eastern side of Nairobi, Makongeni to be precise. And on weekends, my late father liked taking us for walks in the city before it became crowded. So after church service, we would go to town. And one of his favorite sports was the street, dividing the University of Nairobi and the Norfolk Hotel. And further down that street is the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation.
Okay.
And so whenever we were on that street, the Norfolk Hotel is directly opposite the entrance to the University of Nairobi. So you would pat my back and say, son, if you have brains, you belong at the university.
I see.
And once you've studied and you have a good job, you can cross over here, the Norfolk, and enjoy your money. You see those tourists? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if there's something between your ears, you can go further down at the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation and tell the world what you know.
I see.
And so that stuck with me. Okay. So the idea of the university was introduced to me at a very early age.
I see.
So that all I wanted was to be a professor. Every time when we were asked, what would you like to be? In future, I always said I wanted to be a professor. And my primary school teacher did not understand how such a young kid already knew about,
being a professor.
Professorship as a professor. Yeah, being a professor, So at a personal level, for me, that was very important. At a professional level, I'll go to 2001. I had the good fortune to be invited by the Ford Foundation to be part of these conversations about the future of African higher education. As you would recall, the 1980s, the 1990s were a crisis era for African higher education. The discourse was one of collapse. The promise of higher education was not being realized.
I see.
The feeling was the dream was being deferred, if not completely collapsed. So I had good fortune to be part of this group. Then as a young person, I just started my master's degree at Kenyatta University. Yeah? And we gathered in Pietermaritzburg here in South Africa.
Yeah.
And good fortune to be in the company of intellectual heavyweights on the continent, philosopher Pauline Huntonji, Njabulo Ndebele, Teko Umoja, Tade Aina, Amina Mama, Peter Kachavivi,
That was a gathering of note.
Exactly. And our task was to dream about the African University of the year 2050.
Okay.
That, in fact, was the moment when I decided this is what I want to do. Okay. Because in that gathering, of course, there was that sense of loss, the collapse of African higher education. We are not living up to our promise. If you go back to the 60s, 1947, when the University of Ghana was established, and across in Nigeria, at Yaba, modern day University of Ibadan, when they were established, I promise, when University of Nigeria and Nsukka was established, why were we establishing these universities? Makerere University, then the epicenter of the University of East Africa. It was part of the project of decolonizing the continent and inspiring the development of the continent. Fast forward, we had the structural adjustment programs, and essentially the assault on African higher education. And so that conversation about the collapse or near collapse and what we needed to do and how African higher education could look like in the year 2050 was very, very important. So the discourse was around revitalizing higher education.
I see.
And for me, at a personal level and at a professional level, that was very, very important. Of course, fast forward, I then became a student of the subject.
I see.
Yeah. When I did my PhD at the University of Cape Town, I decided to look at how universities are funded, because I thought that was critical in terms of not just the sustainability of the university as an organization, but also in terms of the university's knowledge project, which is the reason for existence, and how the university's knowledge project impacts society. Okay. And I had the good fortune, to travel across the world, participating in conferences and related gatherings, talking about African higher education, what the issues are. I had the good fortune to be at the Dakar conference in 2015. As a matter of fact, I was part of the team that wrote the
Okay.
declaration.
Oh, fantastic. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With Professor Paul Zeleza, was leading the team that was putting together the declaration. And the issues were the same. The same issues were discussed in Pietermaritzburg in
Yeah.
2001. The same issues that were discussed earlier. The issues have more or less been the same. How do you drive access
Yeah.
and equity? How do we get marginalized communities into higher education, given the important role of higher education in developing capabilities and enabling upward mobility? How do we get marginalized communities into higher education? How do we make higher education meaningful, quality? Because the concern was that the African universities, the resources, the capacity of staff, and the infrastructure generally did not engender excellence. How do we then, because if you look at excellence as a precursor for achieving the kind of impact that we need, so that becomes very, very critical. What kind of research should we conduct, and
Yeah.
how do we make African universities vibrant research institutions? Because if you look across the world, some of the most impactful, if not the most impactful contributions by universities are through research.
Yes.
That pathway of research. And we are not achieving that. From a research point of view, we've not done significantly well. And so the question was, how do we make sure that African universities, in fact, grow their research and produce meaningful knowledge that has real impact in
I
society?
see.
How we were looking at how universities are funded.
Okay.
That's critical. And we're also looking at governance and management, because to date we still experience these governance challenges across our universities across the continent. And for me, that was very, very important. Then PASGA, the Partnership for African Social and Governance
Yeah.
Research, where I have the good fortune of being the chair of the board.
Okay.
So it's a very interesting experience. It kind of takes me outside of the ivory tower.
Okay. Outside of the lecture hall, as it were.
Yes, yes, in a loose sense. So there we're dealing with real issues. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that we're not dealing with real issues. So we're looking at that research policy interface. Okay, and working with government entities to support evidence data-driven policy. How
Okay.
do we make sure that the knowledge that we produce is impactful? And getting partnerships together, co-creating ideas, and all that. So it's kind of an entire value chain. As a student of the subject, as a practitioner, given my current role as the senior
Yes.
director for institutional planning and monitoring and evaluation. We've just developed a new strategy at the University of Pretoria. I played a
Okay.
central role in developing that strategy by virtue of my position at the institution.
Yeah.
And we are mainstreaming impact, impact. How can our universities be impactful through the various pathways, be it teaching, research, community engagement, partnerships with communities and all that. So maybe I should stop there for now.
No, I think that you are really covering some really key points, because the question that I was going to follow up question before we can move forward was, what was determined in the 2001 meeting in Pietermaritzburg as what has caused the relationship to stagnate and that it wasn't meeting its goals? And why was it a 2050 thing? Because it's just a few years from 2063. What was happening? What were some of the problems that were identified that had caused it not to be responsive or not to be meeting the needs of the continent at the time, that necessitated that meeting
Sorry,
to be convened? Yeah.
Like I mentioned, the 1980s were a difficult period for African universities. The 1990s, very difficult. The rise of globalization, the coercive role of the World Bank, the the idea that African nations and institutions, needed to go through, the structural adjustment programs.
Yeah.
For us to be efficient and effective and all that. The prioritization or privatization, where I was saying, the public higher education sector was not achieving, much. And so let's privatize. We have the defunding of higher education institutions pretty much across the continent. So universities were not realizing their potential. The infrastructure was collapsing. The staff-student ratios were just impossible for a meaningful intellectual experience to happen. All right. And there was this sense of loss. There's this sense of the collapse of the dream of establishing universities on the continent. And so that was the context, and also there was the assault of the public universities by our governments. You would recall that period coincided also with the demand for political pluralism.
Yes, and the Soviet Union was collapsing, was disintegrated, and
Yes.
pluralism emerged, and political expression. It was really happening in the 90s, I can tell you now, even though.
Isn't it?
Yes. There was
So the single party
you've actually identified it, Prof. Sorry to break your word. You've actually identified some of the major shifts that were happening and that would have had big impact on the intellectual development of the continent. Structural adjustment programs, the Soviet Union, end of apartheid in South Africa, all of those shifts were really happening during that time.
Yes, yes. And so, all these things, and the universities were caught in the middle of this. Intellectuals were at the forefront of fighting single party dictatorships, pushing back on these unpopular policies by the World Bank, and all that. And I should clarify something here. Look, my view is, and it's probably an unpopular view, the World Bank's push for structural adjustment fund programs and the defunding of universities, in my view, aligned with the political agenda of the moment, given what I just explained. Yeah.
So linkages, yeah.
So it almost became a perfect excuse. It wasn't me. It's the World Bank that is saying, we must do this, we must do that. You see? But jailing our academics in Kenya, for example. We were jailing our academics. We were sending them to exile. Okay. Student leaders, were being bludgeoned, and it was a very difficult moment. And the university was bruised. Okay. It kind of had lost its spirit. And so the idea was to resurrect that spirit, that sense of purpose. Okay. And your question about 2050, when you're talking about the university, you need a long-term perspective. Given what we had gone through, it was going to be difficult, for example, in 2021 to talk about the African University of the year 2030, for example, 2020 or 2010, So we thought, let's talk long-term.
Yes.
Okay. At that point, the Agenda 2063 had not happened.
Absolutely. It's very recent, actually. Yeah.
It's very recent. Yeah. So the idea was to have a long-term perspective because we recognized that the rebuilding of the African university is going to be a painstaking exercise, that could not be rushed through, that is going to take time, all right, to fix what was broken.
I see.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
So, which leads me to my second question on, if you had a chance, Prof, to build a new African university, and you almost like the most ideal person to answer this question, because this is your area of expertise. If you had a chance to build a new African university from the ground up today, what would it look like? How would it draw on African knowledges, all these challenges you've spoken about, all these external influences, all the lived realities on the ground? How would it draw on African knowledge systems, local realities, rather than replicating models from elsewhere?
Look, that's Solomon, that's a very, very, very good question. A little bit of context.
Okay.
At the 2001 conference or summit, that Ford Foundation organized, the one that I talked about earlier, that's one of the questions that actually kept us busy.
Okay. The African University.
The African University. We were looking at our colonial roots. If you look at universities across the continent, with a few exceptions, if you talk about the university at Fez in Morocco and Al Azhar University in Egypt, in Egypt. So those and a few others in that region could be characterized as the pre-colonial universities.
Okay.
But the rest, from in the sub-Saharan region, especially, and I use the word sub-Saharan very carefully, understand the politics around that. And as I mentioned earlier, if you go to the so-called 1947 universities, the
University of Ghana,
the college at Yaba, now University of Ibadan, and later on you come to Makerere and all those universities, University of East Africa and all that. So they were established in the image of our colonial history.
Correct.
Yeah. So if it was University of Ghana, it was the UK. Cambridge University set the exams and moderated the exam. Cambridge University did the same thing with the University of East Africa. Ali Mazrui talks about exams being sent to Cambridge and the professors there changing the questions. Okay. Saying, no, this is not good enough. And the universities in the so-called Francophone Africa, it was the same story. It was the same story. And then if you look at our post-colonial nation building project, again, it has had a particular bearing on universities and what they've come to be today. And then the third influence would be the various policy dynamics that shape the trajectories of university continent differently. And so given that context, what would an African university look like? And that's not an easy question because again, back to the 2001 Ford Foundation Summit, the question was, is this a university in Africa or an African university? Is it a transplanted institution?
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't talk about a university per se.
Okay.
I would think about a university system.
All right.
Yeah. The Africa of today, we have to think about a university system, given the diverse needs of our societies, given the diversity in our population.
Yeah.
Okay. Given the diversity in terms of the challenges that we are confronted with.
Yeah.
Okay? So how do we think about a university system that collectively gives expression to who we are as a people?
Correct.
That helps us to make sense of our lived realities and produce knowledge that unpacks that reality and produces knowledge that helps us to address the challenges in our context. And so some of the core principles, in my view, that we would have to think about is the question of epistemic pluralism.
Okay.
So the decolonization project, one of the key arguments for it is that the African university today naturalized its colonial heritage and started treating it as though, it was fit for purpose. Okay.
Okay. I like that. That's a very interesting aspect. Very interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah. So if you look at the knowledge that we produce, and we now need to start thinking about epistemic pluralism. If you look at our African knowledge systems, African knowledge systems are inherently integrative. Nature, man, mind, our metaphysical realities and all that. And so if you look at our knowledge systems, they were not fragmented.
Yes.
Okay.
They're almost like an ecosystem.
Exactly. So find physics and chemistry and geography and biology on its own. No, no, no. Early on, we had this integrative understanding of our reality. Okay. And what does that mean in terms of a critical principle of this African university is that we have to be very deliberate about advancing transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, the challenges that we are confronted with, food security, unemployment, climate change, okay, and all other kinds of challenges are very complex challenges. No single discipline can fully address those challenges. Whether you talk about planetary health and all that. So we have to be very deliberately transdisciplinary.
But
Okay.
that is very African in the way you've described it, Prof. Because
Yes.
Africans really, at a very basic level, they have this understand that everything else works in an ecosystem way. That nothing really works, like, for example, they will say loosely that a tree cannot make a forest, which
Aha.
basically explains that we all need all hands to
Aha.
collaborate. At the center of that African experience is collaboration to
Yes.
engage with the
Aha.
challenges together, a certain kind of
Aha.
form of together.
Haven't. We need to rethink that. And I must be careful here. I hope I'm not coming across as advancing the idea of African exceptionalism. No, that's not what
No,
I'm saying.
no.
Yeah. So we need to be careful about, if you look at the governing councils that we have across many universities, they have become a major source of instability at these institutions. So we see lots of strange things happening. We have people who are clueless about the idea of the university, how universities should run, the knowledge project, coming into senior governance roles. And we've seen in a number of other instances, cases where these people come in and they start, seeking behavior and all that. Yeah. So I would, from the word go, we'll have to think about a governance architecture, okay, that will advance or engender stability. Okay, because governance is a big, big issue on the continent. How we fund it is also going to be a very important consideration because over the past 50 or so years, funding has been a major fault line for universities on the continent.
Yeah.
So we have to think very carefully about how we fund it. You cannot withdraw funding and still expect excellence unless you're a magician. I don't know how you do that. You cannot underfund universities and
And
still
expect
expect them.
very high performance.
Exactly. You expect high productivity, impactful research, graduates who make a difference in society. I don't know. I don't know how you achieve that. And then it has to be cosmopolitan by design. I'm concerned about what we are seeing in certain parts of the continent, where now we've got what one could easily characterize as ethnic ghettos.
Okay.
Okay. Universities located in some corners, and they're not seen as universities in the broader sense of the word, seen as these entities belonging in this corner for this community. You see? So we need to demolish that thinking. And it has to be a very, cosmopolitan by design,
Yes.
in terms of
Deliberately.
deliberately, yeah. The students who study at the university, in terms of who teaches at the university,
Yeah.
in terms of the kinds of partnerships that we develop. The other thing that I could go on and on and on, but the other thing that I would then be very deliberate about is the research project.
Okay.
The research project. Yeah. Part of the decolonization project. In fact, a core part of it, in my view, is research. If we need to tackle this knowledge dependency Okay? We talk about models and theories that come from the West. Unless we produce models, theories, concepts that do justice to our reality, we'll continue with dependency.
I have asked the question before of whether African
Yeah.
knowledge systems needs to be anchored in the
Mm-hmm.
global north for it to resonate, for it to then become knowledge. It's as if it seeks some form of quote unquote approval of the global north for it to be
Mm-hmm.
knowledge enough. And the other part of that thinking is that why we still sit with quite a lot of challenges that we haven't been able to overcome because we are looking at these challenges with a different framework that does not correspond to our lived realities? Or is it just because if we don't anchor it to the global north, then we ourselves cannot approve it as knowledge?
So it's a number of things. That's a very complex question, Solomon, that you're asking. So first of all, there's nothing wrong with knowledge produced in the global north. There's nothing inherently wrong. It's the global north researchers producing their knowledge.
Absolutely.
You you cannot fault them for doing that. Okay. Their countries are putting in research. They're investing in PhD production, and they're putting in resources to make sure that the knowledge enterprise is vibrant in their countries. They're interested in studying the others. If you look at the history of conquest, you go to the early days when the British were sending their ships down to Australia, to Africa, wherever they sent them. They had some scientists on those ships.
Okay.
Okay, they had scientists on those ships who wanted to go understand the flora and fauna of the areas they were conquering, wanted to understand the people of the area in the areas they were conquering and those kinds of things. So it goes way back there. So there's nothing wrong with producing their knowledge. We cannot fault them for producing their knowledge. And
Absolutely.
of course, in a context of global competition, it's in their interest to want to influence us. I can't fault them for that. Now, I want to focus on ourselves.
Absolutely.
On ourselves. We have to produce knowledge that makes sense of our reality.
Correct.
Okay? That does justice to our reality. That empowers us as a people. Okay? Unless we invest in the knowledge ecosystem, we're going to struggle to achieve that. The
Correct.
knowledge dependency is going to continue. So if you're looking for something on policy, and all you find is what is produced in the West, what should such a student do? You know, the student is going to use that knowledge. But if a student is trying to understand the paradox of policy making on the continent, and Solomon Atah is an authority in that area. Gerald Ouma is an authority in that area. He's publishing in that area, and we've got centers of excellence across the continent that are trying to unpack this question. Okay? Then we democratize knowledge. We do justice to a reality. Okay. So for me, the beginning point is for us to invest in the knowledge enterprise.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. They are not going to study things for us. Yes, they will, but they'll do it through their lenses, and we cannot fault them for that. We have to get into that space. We have to own that space. We have to be the experts on our reality. Okay? We have to provide counter views, to global north views that do not do justice to our reality. We have to provide evidence to support our governance systems. We have to provide evidence to support policy making and make sure the partnerships are working between ourselves, institutions of higher learning, and government. All right. But what we see today is our governments bring in consultants. Of course, I should add that it's not always the case that they bring in consultants from the global north because they don't have we don't have our own who can do that work. No. So yes, let's invest in the knowledge project. Let's get our students to do PhD. Let us let's embrace excellence, high quality work, and develop this culture of doing research and unpacking our reality in such a manner that we are able to understand it better and others can understand it through our lens.
Prof, thank you. That is well said. Like, you've given a lot of direction, I can tell you now, in terms of how we can start to re-understand where we are as a people. Moving on, Prof. Having observed multiple institutions, including your work at the Partnership of African Social and Governance Research, do African universities share a common intellectual language? I know you've touched on this a little bit, but maybe this you can still give me some other pieces of clarity. Do African universities share a common intellectual language, or do they operate in separate silos shaped by history, policy, and local priorities? You've mentioned this, but perhaps there's just something there. Are we speaking, is the continent's intellectual body as a whole, all the universities, are they speaking to each other? Are they speaking the same language? For example, let me just add this piece of thought to it. I would think that the AU, for example, would then say, this is the areas that they cannot grapple with it, or they are grappling with it. They want to send this into the knowledge ecosystem, like you said, the knowledge enterprise. That the knowledge enterprise can then figure out, quote unquote, how to deal with these problems, which means, is the African university a single body? Are they all doing the same thing towards the African agenda? Or is every individual university just trying to do the little they can?
So I wouldn't say that at the moment that African universities share a common intellectual language.
Okay.
And I should hasten to add that that is not necessarily a bad thing. We need some heterogeneity when it comes to these perspectives. A multiplicity of perspectives is very important. And as you've correctly said, and we mentioned early in the discussion, our trajectories are varied. They've been shaped by our colonial histories, our post-independence nation building realities, and contemporary policy pressures across different, spaces on the continent. And these realities kind of shape, the intellectual focus of our institutions. But I should hasten also to add that I see a shared intellectual aspiration emerging, that is rooted in Africa's development challenges, the point you made earlier around epistemic renewal, and also the global repositioning that we are seeing on the continent. We are seeing a number of institutions on the continent that are driving this, that complement what the universities are doing. So we're seeing, for example, CODESRIA, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, playing a very important role here. The African Research Universities Alliance is, in fact, kind of seized with this question, from a research point of view. PASGA, as we mentioned earlier. So what I see emerging is shared thematic concerns. I see shared thematic concerns across the continent. Concerns around decolonization, all right? And the thing around decolonization with the 2015, 2016 events here in South Africa, fees must fall and roads must fall and all. It kind of revitalized that discourse that had been around for long. If you look at the history of the University of East Africa, that there were those debates. If you go to the University of Nairobi and Ngugi wa Thiong'o in the English department, debates around decolonizing the teaching of English. It's English department or Department of English, for example. Shared thematic concerns around governance. Governance is a big issue, on the continent and now globally. I shouldn't say now globally. It has always been a big issue globally.
Mm.
There's shared thematic concern around climate and sustainability, around the youth. You've seen what the Gen Zs are doing, be it in Kenya, be it in I think it was
Madagascar.
Morocco, Madagascar, and so the youth have become a central focus across the continent. Digital transformation, is also an important thematic area. Now, if one were to look at the question of intellectual languages through the lens of shared thematic concerns, then one could say that we're seeing a number of these becoming cross-cutting across the continent. We are seeing collaborative doctoral training happening across the continent. We are seeing challenge-led research happening across the continent, open access knowledge platforms that are happening. And these I should add also that the open access knowledge platforms are helping to forge what one could characterize as shared epistemic spaces. Now, the point I would just to kind of, my final thought would be, like I mentioned earlier, I do not think we need a homogeneous, a uniform intellectual language. For me, that would be dangerous. In my view, what I need, and I hope I'm not coming across as normative, what we need is a connected plurality, diverse epistemologies that speak to each other. More importantly, through African realities, through African values, and through African aspirations.
Absolutely wonderful. Prof, looking at teaching and learning across African university, what innovations excites you? Excites you the most, whether in digital tools, curriculum design, or ways of thinking that could make higher education more relevant to the continent's challenges? This is in light of our today is this AI that is almost taking a very big space. There's a generation of people that will never know the world without AI. So how is this going to reshape teaching and learning in African universities, and what innovations are there that are really exciting to you?
Look, how we teach has always been a big issue, in African higher education. And one of the concerns in the early days was that our teaching lacked innovation, that our teaching was aligned with what Paulo Freire describes as the banking approach to teaching, where you deposit material into the students as you would deposit money in a bank account. And then when the assessment period comes, you withdraw the material as you would withdraw money from the ATM. In other words, it was kind of largely about recall. So get the students. Yeah, we had this challenge for a long time of the so-called yellow and yellowing notes, where the lecturers, in the 80s, 90s, and I think the 2000s, probably still happening in some institutions, the lecturers would come with yellow and yellowing notes. So it tells you the guy has not updated the notes. It's the same notes you 10 years ago. And so he's struggling to keep the pieces together. And so that was always a big challenge.
Yeah.
And it related to the kinds of graduates that we produced. It related to the challenge of innovation on the continent. Because if students are not cultured or socialized rather to be innovative, to push boundaries, to be creative, you cannot expect them to be creative and innovative. Now, to answer you directly, given that context, I'm seeing a number of moves that are quite exciting, in the pedagogical space.
Okay.
One of them is the integration of teaching, research, community engagement. Okay. So we're seeing teaching supporting the research agenda, and research supporting teaching as well, and community engagement also supporting both teaching and research. So we're seeing that integration. So we're seeing a lot more learner-centered pedagogies, inquiry-driven pedagogies, which are essential for driving research. If you do not engender inquiry and curiosity and creativity, it becomes challenging for these students to become good researchers. And the community engagement bit kind of grounds them in their realities. And related to that is the emergence of what some are calling challenge-based research teaching, where students are having to engage with communities and address real issues that affect communities. So it's pedagogy that of course gives students the opportunity to practice what they're taught in the lecture hall. So they don't experience these things once they've graduated. No, because that has always been the challenge, you know. So I'm seeing that happening on the continent. The question of curriculum innovation, you cannot talk pedagogy and not talk about curriculum innovation. You know, it's quite important. And there's been those debates around curriculum innovation. Okay, fees must fall, you know, issues around curriculum innovation and all that. And one of the things that I'm seeing now on the continent is the point I made earlier around transdisciplinarity by design.
Correct. Deliberately.
Okay. Yes. So that students who are doing engineering are taking modules in philosophy, ethics. If you're going to do AI, ethics is very, very important.
Absolutely.
Or they're taking modules, you know, in environmental sustainability. But even in areas that on the face of it don't look related, you know, where you are doing medicine, but you take a module in music.
Yeah.
Remember the unity of knowledge that we spoke about earlier, the integrative nature of African epistemology?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm seeing that it's early days, baby steps. I wouldn't characterize it as mature, yeah,
but
I'm seeing it's there. It's emerging. It's happening.
Yeah.
A big one, of course, is the you know, embracing of hybrid teaching and learning.
Okay.
And this was spurred by COVID. Yes, it had been there. You know, we had the African university project. You know, I think it was headquartered in Nairobi. I don't know if it's still there, but for a long time it was based in Nairobi with the online and all that. You know, and that was quite revolutionary, if you will, on the continent. Now we're talking hybrid. And that's a very important innovation because society has evolved. You know, it's become challenging, for example, for working students to come and spend an entire semester sitting in a lecture hall. So then we've got hybrid modes, even for students themselves. You know, I mean, young students rather, you know, who are not working. And it's one of those innovations that I see happening. It was aided or speeded up, for want of a better word, by COVID. You know, when we had to close shop and people had to go home.
Yeah.
And we initially thought it's just going to be a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, 1 month. We realized this thing is not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So universities decided, you know, this emergency online teaching and all that. And I've seen that has kind of remained. And now universities are improving on that, you know, putting in place the infrastructure to support that and investing in the requisite pedagogy. Another one that I need to talk about, and the PASGA, the organization whose board I chair, has been on the front line of supporting this, the Pedagogical Leadership Program.
Correct.
You know, yeah. Why is this important? PASGA identified a gap. So universities are institutions of higher learning. Okay, we prefer to see ourselves as predominantly being research institutions. That's okay. But the bulk of what we do is teach.
Correct.
That's why we got undergraduate students. Yes. That's why we have our undergraduate students on our campuses and even postgraduate students. That's the bulk of what we do is to teach. And I should add, is the one thing that distinguishes us from your research entities out there that just do research. Yeah. And now PASGA identified this gap. Most of the people teaching in universities do not have pedagogical knowledge. Okay? It's the guy who did engineering, you know, he's an engineer who comes in and now must teach engineering students without pedagogical
background.
Skills, a background. Okay. So PASGA identified that and developed this program, the pedagogical leadership program, to support lecturers who do not have a pedagogical background to acquire that capability.
Well, that's
And it
great.
worked very, yes, yes. It worked very well, understanding students, how do students learn? How do you pace your content? How do you challenge students? What is this thing about learner-centered pedagogies? How do we make learning meaningful? How do we turn assessment not to be a competition between the lecturer and the student? Because when we went to college, at times it felt like the lecturers wanted to prove that they were more intelligent than us, which is obvious. They were lecturers.
Yeah. That's very interesting.
Isn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely interesting. Yeah.
How do you assess students, in ways that support their growth and development?
Absolutely.
So I'm seeing good moves happening across the continent and of course globally. Yes.
Absolutely. That was a fantastic response, Prof. Let's move
Thank
on.
you. Yeah.
When you evaluate institutions, what science tells you that universities are genuinely changing, improving lives, shaping society? I think you've touched on this question, Prof. You've really touched on this question. Okay, now let's take a break and look into the future, look into the crystal ball.
Yes.
Thinking towards 2063, the Africa we want and beyond.
Yes. Yes.
This is a big one at the AU meetings and so on.
Yes.
I think this is when Africa turns 100, I don't know, after the AU was formed.
Yes.
Thinking towards 2063 and beyond, what principal commitment should African university hold onto if they are to remain meaningful to the continent's development, culture, and knowledge production? In your discussion in general, Prof, I think you've sort of really covered them, some aspects of it. But let's just look at 2040, Africa will have the youngest population in the world. 2063, AU turns 100. And we have all of this happening at once. And this is the best time to be alive. What should be happening now in the university for 2063?
This is an interesting one. And it's the second time I'm being asked to dream about the African University of the future. In 2001, we were dreaming about the African University of the year 2050. And now you're challenging me to dream about the African University of the year 2063. Very, very excellent question. Look, and you've touched on it. The Africa of 2063 is going to be a completely different Africa. Completely different. We don't know how the technological shifts are going to look like. But I suspect there would be, the technological developments that we're seeing would even have grown, to a completely different level. Okay. We don't know how the economies of the continent are going to look like, but I suspect they're going to be different. The politics of the continent. We want to silence guns. We want to engender democracy. 2063 is likely to be very different. Yeah, many people who are alive today will not be there in 2063. Okay. Now, we have to make sure that our universities co-evolve as the African reality changes. We cannot afford to have African universities remaining static and reacting, to changes in its environment. African universities, from an evolutionary perspective, must co-evolve as our societies evolve. They have to be able to shape the realities in the environment and not just be able to react and not just react to those realities. Okay? We have to up our game. You talked about the youth, and that's very important. They're going to be a significant majority. What does that mean? We have to be super intentional about differentiation. We have to have different university types to address the different needs of our youth. They will want different kinds of skills. Okay. So we have this super university, supermarket type university that provides everything to everyone. It's not going to be possible. So we have to have differentiation by design. So we've got different university types that address different skills needs, that address different needs of the continent. It's quite expensive for us to have a research intensive university, but we need them. So we need to identify a set of universities that we deliberately invest in to make sure they're at the cutting edge of knowledge production. Okay? We are confronted with zoonotic diseases, COVID. Which are the top, COVID as an example, which are the top universities in Africa that are producing cutting edge knowledge in zoonotic diseases? Name one for me.
Yeah.
Okay? Okay. We're dealing with planetary health issues. Which are the top institutions on the continent that are producing cutting edge knowledge on issues to do with planetary health? Okay? We're talking about these technologies. We become net consumers of these technologies, AI and whatnot. Okay? Which are the top institutions on the continent that are producing cutting edge knowledge in the area of technology? Which ones? For us to have those universities, and I'm not saying that they're not there, they are there, but they're few and far between. For us to have those kinds of institutions, we have to be very deliberate, and invest in them. We're talking about cancer has become a pandemic across the continent. 10, 15, 20 years ago, cancer and other non-communicable diseases were seen as diseases of the rich. But now, if you look at the people who are affected the most by these non-communicable diseases, it's cutting across the various social classes. Who is producing knowledge in these fields? So I would like the Africa of 2060 to be autonomous from a knowledge production point of view. I would like the African University of 2063 to have different kinds of universities that address the different needs of the various sections of society. I would want the African University of 2063 to be fully funded. We need to stop this madness of subjecting our universities to a starvation budget where they just barely get along. Universities cannot thrive on a starvation budget. We can't. We need, if we're talking differentiation, I'd like to push the envelope a little bit.
Go for it, Prof.
Why don't we have a differentiated regional higher education systems? Look at Ghana. They have Cote d'Ivoire on the other side. They have Nigeria across. They've got a few other countries around there. What stops Ghana and the countries around it to come up with a higher education area and have a differentiated approach? Okay, and a system across the various regions.
You do this, you do this, you do this. You specialize in this, you specialize in this.
Of course, politically, I know there are challenges there, but it's not doable if we look at it from a collaboration, partnership, and alliance building point of view, as opposed to a competition point of view. The University of East Africa was a good example. What stops East Africa as a region to have a differentiated higher education system, so that what we have is fully, properly funded with a clear focus, and it cannot afford to be everything to everyone. So those would be my dreams for the African University of 2063. One that is intellectually autonomous in terms of knowledge, one that foregrounds African epistemologies. It does not, I don't say that in the exclusive sense, no. We need to have all the knowledges. I would like African universities that give expression to our cultures and languages. Yeah. Look at the language you and I are communicating in. Don't get me wrong. We're speaking in English because it's a tool. We use it as a tool. Yes. Okay. But why can't a Kan be a language of intellectual engagement across the continent? Why can't Swahili be a language of research, a language of science across the continent? Yeah. Why can't Zulu become a language of intellectual engagement across the continent? That's my dream of the African University of 2063.
Prof, this has been fantastic. Absolutely. You've really covered, and I think that's because you've covered across the board within your expertise and even touching on various other areas. Governance, funding, differentiation, and the African university that will be able to meet us at our points of need. What else did we leave out, Prof? Any final thoughts, anything that you feel like we didn't touch on for this very wonderful conversation that we've had?
Yeah, the politicians should stop interfering.
I know. I wanted to ask a question earlier when we started our conversation
Yes.
around. I remember I did ask a question around what could have been the reasons for higher education stagnation in the 80s and 90s. I think you mentioned the structural adjustment. I mentioned Soviet Union, or maybe the collapse of the disintegration of Soviet Union, etc. But there's also the idea that the politicians could not deal with the fact that there was a need for political pluralism, that people wanted various forms of political engagement and not just the one that was handed down to us from by the colonizers, if you like. So it seems that we haven't really fully recovered from that epoch that saw, because if you look at how things have evolved in the past 10, 15 years on the continent, one can argue that we are almost back to where we were pre-1960, because most of the ruling parties in the continent are not losing elections. There's still some forms of those pre-1960 ideas creeping back into national discourse, into political experiences on the continent. And this somewhat could be distracting, especially to the agenda of the academia.
So, look, you raise a very important point. So my response to that would be, one, politicians should understand that universities are not enemies of the state. Okay?
Yeah.
They are very, very important for the continuity of our societies. Universities, and I hope I don't sound arrogant when I say this, universities have the largest concentration of the nation's brightest. That's an institution that needs to be nurtured, not destroyed. Okay? Anywhere in the world, you will not find a concentration of society's brightest, a higher concentration of society's brightest outside of your institutions of higher learning. Okay?
That's powerful. So
universities are assets. This is your future. The continuity of the state and our societies as vibrant societies require that we invest in our knowledge institutions. Okay? And so we need to manage these contradictory relationships. We need to manage this contradictory relationship between the political space and the institutions of higher learning. Okay? Trying to destroy universities, you're not destroying the university per se, you're destroying the future of society. It means you cannot produce doctors, that should look after the health of your population. It means when you fall sick, you all must fly out of the country to get treatment. Okay? It means you cannot produce top engineers who are going to look after your infrastructure and all that. It means when you want to get engineers, you must import them. It means you cannot get your well-trained, grounded teachers. Okay? Where are teachers trained? They're trained in institutions of higher learning. Okay? So the future of our societies, in my view, and I don't mean to be arrogant, is tied to the future of the university.
Prof, this has been
symbiotic
fantastic.
Related. Yes, thank you.
This has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the Solomon Atah Podcast.